The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. The Pharisees went off and plotted how they might entrap Jesus in speech. They sent their disciples to him with the Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are a truthful man, and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. And you are not concerned with anyone's opinion, for you do not regard a person's status. So tell us then, what is your opinion? Is it lawful to pay the census tax to Caesar or not?" Knowing their malice, Jesus said, "Why are you testing me, you hypocrites? Show me the coin that pays the census tax." Then they handed him the Roman coin, and he said to them, "Whose image is this and whose inscription?" And they replied, "Caesar's." At that he said to them, "Then repay Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God." The Gospel of the Lord. And they complimented him, saying, "You don't regard another person's status or anyone's opinion. You're not concerned with that." Well, today's gospel, I thought, is there some kind of a musical device or lyric that could give me an insight into today's gospel? And I went looking for an old song about relationships and how you don't have to be this or that to be in relationship with me, and I couldn't think of which songs I had recalled. I couldn't recall them, and then of course I looked at the top 10 list, and the first three songs on the top 10 list this week are from Drake, the Canadian artist, and I assume he must have dropped an album this week, because it's not unusual for an immediate jump to occur for new songs that are released, at least for about a week or so. However, I didn't find much help there. Some of the lyrics in Drake's songs are not helpful, and unfortunately, I think Drake lately has been pretty negative about relationships. Not sure what that's about, but he clearly has some negative views, especially of women in some of those songs, so wasn't going to go there, obviously. But maybe that makes the point of today's gospel in a strange way, because in our relationships, we are maybe looking for, certain qualities and aspects, things in common, right? Except we might at times have too many conditions on how we place upon each other the expectations or the hopes of who they are. And instead, maybe we should be more like Jesus, as he's complimented in this gospel for being someone who isn't too concerned about everybody else's opinion. And more importantly, they compliment him by saying, you are someone who doesn't regard status. Now, that's an interesting compliment from these folks who, of course, are trying to trip Jesus up. But that's exactly the kind of compliment maybe they need to give him, hoping it would pull him into a conversation where he can continue to do that, where he can start to speak without status, regarding status, because that's exactly what the Roman Empire and the culture of his time is built upon. It's all about status. It's all about who belongs to who and who plays what role, and everybody staying in their place in pretty oppressive systems. I think the estimation is at the Roman Empire at the time of Jesus, about 2/3 of the population were enslaved in one form or the other, bound to obligational servitude with very few ways out of that. Maybe only the army would be a way out of it, and of course, no options for women, who, according to the Greek and Roman system, didn't even have full personhood. The philosophical ideas of the time wouldn't even have counted women as full persons. And so it's interesting that Jesus is someone who completely butts up against that culture, and in fact is countercultural. He, in fact, doesn't regard status, and his movement won't. That's why it'll be so accessible to so many people, especially women, and especially people who are living in servitude or enslaved. They will join the Christian movement in great numbers as soon as it takes off upon his death. And there's a way in which that message of Jesus of Nazareth and his proclamation of this reign of God, where this kind of status isn't important. I don't know that we're as obsessed about status as we were certainly when I was growing up, or certainly in past historical eras. We are, I think, concerned about whether like your opinions or agree with certain aspects of your thinking. And that's important, don't get me wrong, it is important. But I do think there's a way in which you and I need to have an openness that allows us to encounter each other at that basic human reality, those basic human needs. We all have the same basic needs. We all, in some ways, have the same joys, the same pains, the same ordinary struggles. And so for you and for me, we might want to look at how Jesus is this man who is known in his own time as being someone who's not going to look at that kind of stuff that denotes status and therefore separates us, but instead has a kind of openness to everybody he's going to encounter. And in that openness, then, can we find some immediate common ground and some ways in which we can, in fact, encourage each other in our goodness, encourage each other in our practice of justice and our way of trying to live peacefully and respectfully with one another. We have to do that on the individual level if we have any hopes or aspirations for that to happen at these larger and societal levels. Because you and I both know we live in a world that is in incredible conflict right now, and major wars around the globe. Everybody's got to decide where they stand in some of those conflicts to some extent, and conflicts that aren't even being mentioned in the news in more remote parts of the world where they're not even being acknowledged in the international press. People are really struggling, and then we have deep, deep divisions within our own country that do separate us. And I get that sometimes we don't want to get into those kind of personal conflicts, especially over things like politics or maybe the economy or certain issues. But the fact of the matter is you and I have this Jesus who's not going to look at what categories we fall into, but have an openness to the real humanity of every person. And in that openness, can we then consider that we don't have to then struggle in our relationships as much as maybe we do, but instead to have an openness to that. In today's gospel, Jesus is, of course, suggested that they're trying to get him to speak out against the government, because their plan here, of course, is to then stoke up his reputation as an anti-Roman figure so that they can then get the Roman authorities to eventually persecute and kill him. Their plan eventually does work, by the way, as we all know. However, Jesus, understanding exactly that scheme, doesn't bite. And instead, at the end of today's gospel, he's saying, you know what? The government's going to ask something of you. You got to pay your taxes. Do that. But understand that you also live according to something more, something deeper, something greater. And that is the ways, the attitudes, the really sense of self that belongs to God in you. And you've got to represent that in your relationships. If you and I really took that seriously and really said, okay, I'm not going to change necessarily the system of taxation or maybe some other social systems, but my individual actions do add up. And they can add up to creating a different kind of environment in which we have a deep respect for one another. And in that mutual respect, regardless of our status, regardless of where we lie on any number of issues, if I can at least acknowledge that humanity in every other person, I'm contributing to a different kind of environment that may then therefore change these systems that need to be changed, that desperately need to be changed. And then maybe you and I can write the kind of songs that speak to that and talk to our friend Drake and say, hey, maybe our relationships and your relationships, all of our relationships can be a lot better, and we may not have to complain about them so much if we adapt and adopt this attitude of that mutual openness and respect that I think Jesus is representing in today's gospel and calls you and I to live in really practical ways. Amen.